All right, let's dive right into an explainer on one of the most massive and, frankly, most consequential empires in human history, the Ottoman Empire. When we talk about global superpowers today, we usually measure their dominance in what, decades? But the state we're exploring today didn't just measure its run in decades, it measured it in centuries. To really put that into perspective, this single empire lasted for over 600 years. Born from a small Anatolian principality around 1299 by a tribal leader named Osman I, this empire literally outlasted the mighty Byzantine Empire. It survived the entire European Renaissance, and it stayed a major geopolitical player right up until the dawn of the 20th century. That is some serious staying power. And their sheer scale? Absolutely staggering. Look at this growth. Back in 1481, they controlled just over 1.2 million square kilometers. Fast forward to 1521, and that number had nearly tripled to 3.4 million. By their absolute peak in 1683, they were spanning a massive 5.2 million square kilometers. We're talking a footprint across 3 different continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Since we're tackling 6 centuries of incredibly dense history, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll hit the rise of an empire, the peak and the power, governing a diverse world, the long decline begins, and finally, the final collapse. So starting right off with Section 1, the rise of an empire. Tracing their expansion from that obscure little Anatolian principality into a transcontinental powerhouse is pretty wild. We see how the Ottomans ruthlessly capitalized on a declining Byzantine state to secure their foothold in Europe. Founded in 1299, they pushed outward incredibly fast. By 1389, their pivotal victory at Kosovo effectively wiped out Serbian power in the region. And the absolute crown jewel of this early expansion, that came in 1453 when Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror captured the heavily defended city of Constantinople, which definitively ended the Byzantine Empire once and for all. But, it wasn't just raw military might driving this. The devastation of the Black Death had severely weakened all their neighbors. Byzantine territories were left totally demographically and militarily exhausted by the plague, and the Ottomans strategically leveraged that vacuum to push their borders outward at just an astonishing pace. Which brings us to Section 2, the peak and the power. The crucial turning point where this empire truly transitioned into an undisputed global superpower happens right in the 16th century. Under the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the state prospered economically and militarily like never before. His campaigns were insanely successful. He captured Belgrade in 1521, won a historic, crushing victory at the Battle of Mohawks in 1526 to push deep into Central Europe, and then swung east to take Baghdad from the Persians in 1535. This secured vital overland trade routes and established vast naval dominance. This set up a genuinely fascinating global dynamic. The world was effectively locked in a multi-continental stalemate between 2 evenly matched global giants. On one hand, you have the Iberian Union stepping up as the leaders of the Christian Crusaders in the West. On the other, the Ottoman Caliphate, acting as the leaders of Muslims worldwide in the East. And they fought relentlessly across zones spanning all the way from the Mediterranean Sea right to the Indian Ocean. Moving into Section 3, governing a diverse world. So here's the big question. How do you actually hold a transcontinental empire together? Because ruling 3 continents absolutely requires some next-level statecraft. To maintain order over so many vastly different peoples, the government used what's called the millet system. These were autonomous confessional communities, where the state granted non-Muslims varying levels of autonomy to manage their own affairs, raise their own taxes, and resolve internal disputes. It's a really fascinating early example of religious pluralism being used as a practical tool for governance. Demographically, even as late as 1914, the empire was remarkably diverse. As we can see, it was nearly 81% Muslim and about 19% non-Muslim, largely made up of Jews, Christian Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians. Providing legal protection and political autonomy to nearly a fifth of their population through that millet system we just talked about, well, that was absolutely essential for maintaining any kind of imperial harmony. At the exact same time, the empire relied on another highly unique system called the Devshirme. This was a process of recruiting Christian boys from the Balkans. These youths were brought into the empire, educated in elite palace boarding schools, and specifically trained to staff the absolute highest ranks of the state administration and those elite military units, like the famous Janissaries. Of course, managing all this required an incredibly nuanced dual legal system. On one side, you had Islamic Sharia courts led by a judge known as a qadi, which actually focused pretty heavily on integrating local customs.
And then on the other side, you had the non-Muslim millet courts, designed for distinct religious groups. This structure deliberately balanced central dynastic law with local authority, which is what allowed culturally different groups to coexist within the same borders for so long.
All right, on to Section 4. The long decline begins. Look, no empire can stay at the absolute peak forever. By the late 18th century, the geopolitical tides started turning drastically against the Ottomans as they faced rapidly industrializing Western powers. That famous moniker, the sick man of Europe, emerged in the mid-19th century, and it perfectly encapsulated their struggle. The empire was falling behind Western technological and military advancements. They were bleeding territory to Russian expansion, and they were getting crushed by crippling foreign debt heavily controlled by European banks that effectively dictated their domestic economy.
In a desperate attempt to modernize and centralize their power, the government enacted the sweeping Tanzimat reforms. They tried to create a modern conscripted army to replace the outdated Janissaries, rigorously reform the banking system, swap out elements of religious law for secular law, and build modern factories just to try and compete with Europe.
But despite these massive reform efforts, the empire was just battered by relentless crises. They suffered a devastating defeat in the Russo-Turkish War, which cost them vast Balkan territories. They were literally forced to declare bankruptcy in 1875 and then watch the British occupy Egypt in 1882. Rising ethnic nationalism in those aggressive European banks severely fractured the empire from the inside out.
And that brings us to Section 5, the final collapse.
We're now entering the devastating final chapter of the empire, unfolding in the chaotic early 20th century. Entering World War I proved to be a completely fatal decision. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers in 1914, but they were rapidly overwhelmed on multiple fronts. They battled Russian forces in the Caucasus, faced heavy Allied assaults, and internally, they had to fight the massive Arab Revolt in 1916, which was backed by the British, specifically to push Ottoman forces out of the Middle East entirely.
We also must impartially note the devastating humanitarian tragedies that occurred during this wartime collapse. According to the source material, the Ottoman government carried out deportation and ethnic cleansing policies that resulted in genocides against its own citizens. This led to the widespread killing of up to 1.5 million Armenians alongside large-scale massacres committed against the empire's Greek and Assyrian minorities.
The defeat in the war ultimately led to the total partition and dissolution of the state. They signed the Armistice of Mudros in 1918. Then, in 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres partitioned the remaining imperial territories among the victorious Allied powers. Finally, a Turkish nationalist movement launched a successful war of independence, and in 1922, the 600-year-old Ottoman Sultanate was officially abolished forever.
So when you look at the borders of the modern Middle East and Eastern Europe today, the ongoing conflicts, the strategic alliances, the demographics, I'll leave you to wonder. How much of our modern world is just the aftermath of the Ottoman collapse? How much of our current geopolitical landscape is simply the lingering shadow of this fallen 600-year-old giant? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking to understand the history that shapes our world today.